It's a joy to be with you here on this morning. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, but before I lived in Seattle, I lived in Denver, Colorado for 6 years. And so there's a special joy in my heart when I see sunshine on snowy mountains. There was a certain kind of homecoming this morning looking out the windows at the natural beauty here. There is a tall steel fence that draws a line between the U.S. and Mexico at certain points along the almost 2,000-mile border between nations. We stood before it as a group, gazing through to the other side. On one side is Nogales, Mexico, and on the other, Nogales, Arizona, highlighting how this place is actually one place that has been divided as a means of separating, controlling, and exploiting people. The fence where we stood is constructed of steel slats, towering 15 feet in the air and placed 4 inches apart, just wide enough for family and friends to visit one another and gaze upon their loved ones, passing hands and arms through the narrow gaps to reach out and to hold each other. But as we stood there, this too had recently been cut off. Where we stood, just a week before, the U.S. Army had strung razor-sharp concertina wire high and low to further militarize this divide. Alejandro, the young man who was our teacher and guide that week, told us a story of how a caravan of queer and trans migrants called La Caravana had arrived to that very point on the Mexico side several months before. Activists from the area, queer and trans community members, met them there on the U.S. side to celebrate and to welcome their arrival, passing back and forth paletas, popsicles, tamales, sodas, and hands outstretched to say, "I see you. I love you. You made it." And he shared that shortly thereafter was when the razor wire was installed, making such moments of community, connection, and resilience nearly impossible. I realized then that this fence, this wall, it's not only an imposing physical barrier and harsh political boundary. This wall is a spiritual crisis, walling us off from one another and from our own humanity. So a year ago, in the middle of a snowstorm that nearly shut down Seattle, it was so big you might have even heard about it over here, I managed, with the help of a maybe somewhat reckless Lyft driver, to make it to the airport, to fly from Seattle to Tucson, Arizona, where I joined with a group of other UU religious professionals to learn together about immigration, to study and hear about the tensions of the U.S.-Mexican border, and most importantly, to hear stories from those who are most impacted by the pressures facing them and their communities. Our trip was coordinated through the UU College of Social Justice and Border Links, an organization there on the ground that has been there for many years, connected to the Presbyterian Church. And our group was led by a young man, Alejandro, who is there in the middle, covered in the, carrying so many of the water jugs. Alejandro was born in Mexico, came as a young child to the U.S. where he was raised. And along this whole week together, he shared with us stories of what it was like to live in the borderlands between nations, afoot in both worlds, but not fully home in either. Alejandro identifies as queer, and this too was part of his experience, doubling the impact, expanding that impact of living in both worlds, making him more vulnerable. So this week it was a profound, eye-opening, and heartbreaking experience. These images is of all of these names in a prayer garden in Tucson, where people come to light candles for those who are in transition, those who are ill, and to add their names to this tree of prayers. And so from this week, I carry with me still individual stories about migration and detention, and images and experiences of the systemic racism that is driving it, that is disguised in this language of legal and illegal. And I carry with me still the surreal feeling of walking through the desert where migrants had traveled there just earlier that day, driven by both hope and desperation. And so on this morning, on my heart, are the faces and names of people and organizations who are resilient and resisting within these circumstances. And with gratitude and commitment in my heart, I share with you some of their stories. And I do so with some caution because they are not easy stories. And I want to take care not to sensationalize the traumas that people are enduring each day. So I share with you these stories with some caution because there's so much yet I do not understand and cannot understand from where I am within the system. And there's so much context that cannot be shared on a single morning, such as how it's nearly impossible to migrate from the U.S. to the U.S. from Mexico and Central America by legal means, nearly impossible. Or how essential immigrant labor is to the U.S. economy and how essential it has been in our history to keep that labor exploitable. Or how our economic structures themselves are designed in this way, politically, to keep them vulnerable. And so I ask you to please receive these stories that I share this morning with care and with reverence, because each are stories that connect to thousands, millions of individual lives, of families who live in this country and people who are dreaming of a day when they might arrive, and the many who are caught right now in this limbo that is the detention and deportation system. And now, since this trip a year ago, the Remain in Mexico policy, which is keeping so many people who are refugees caught on the Mexican side of the border and extremely vulnerable to violence there. And so within this time of fear-mongering, hate speech, and hateful policy towards immigrants, I share with you some of the stories and experiences that were entrusted to me. Painful stories, but they are necessary. So migration is as old as the human species. For tens of thousands of years, people have left their homelands in search of conditions to support their life and the lives of their children. Driven by a need for land and water to sustain them, they've sought places. We have sought places where life might flourish. If not for them, then for the next generation. Over thousands of years, people have traveled for life, to seek it out, and guided by visions of greater freedom and opportunity, but also all too often throughout history, migration has been the product of violence, of wars, enslavement, greed, and colonization. In our present moment, also, many who are in motion are compelled by the forces of a changing climate, making places that were once home now unstable or unsafe. And for those who have come to the border of the U.S. over the past decades, particularly from Mexico and Central America, many are running from poverty and violence that has been aided and abetted by U.S. economic policies such as NAFTA and military political interventions such as what has happened in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua over the last decades. Many of you probably remember the wars of the 1980s in Central America and the corresponding sanctuary movement here in the U.S. as waves of refugees were coming up from Central America seeking safety. And yet the U.S. government refused to see them as refugees because of the U.S. government's role in what was happening in the destabilizing of those regions. My own ancestors came to this country about 3 centuries ago. I am the descendant of German farmers who came seeking land upon which they could plant, harvest, and raise their children. And this was long before anything that could be considered legal or illegal immigration. When Europeans, those who would become to be known as white, arrived to this land, displacing indigenous people through disease, warfare, and nation building to plant their own lives in the soil. And so this is my complicated inheritance. And though I thank my ancestors for their labors and resolve, who am I to say that I have any more right to life and liberty than anyone else? That my parents' concern for the safety and well-being of their children is any more valid than any parent who is kept up at night fearing for their children's lives? For who owns the earth? Who has the authority to say that someone is allowed their search for survival? Who gets to decide which people come to this land? So this is the question that our guide Alejandro posed to us after our first full day in Tucson. That afternoon, we had gone to a federal criminal courthouse in the 9th District. This is outside, a picture of it outside, to watch a process called Operation Streamline. Operation Streamline was developed in 2005 and is indicative of a larger, dangerous shift towards criminalizing migration. Previously, migration has been classified as a civil, not criminal offense. But on that day, we watched 75 immigrants being rapidly processed in a federal criminal court. The immigrants who were processed had been apprehended in the desert mere days before. They came in still with the dust of the desert on their boots. They were apprehended on their way back to seeing family, to reuniting with family, arrested as they tried to walk away from the violence of their home countries, detained for trying to seek work. And there they were brought into the courtroom with their hands and their waists shackled together. And they looked weary, and many stumbled as they walked, as their shoelaces had been removed by the Border Patrol to reduce suicide risk. Could feel just the despair and powerlessness there in the courtroom. In groups of 10, they were brought before the judge and asked a repetition of questions to guide them to take a plea deal. It had all been orchestrated beforehand by the prosecutor. Often the judge only asked the question once to the group of 10 and then said same question over and over and over down the line. The lawyers present were not immigration lawyers, but criminal lawyers, who we were told are often unfamiliar with immigration law and how to advocate for those who have legitimate asylum cases, who are seeking asylum, running from violence, or how to advocate for those with family and community here in the United States. Immediate deportation awaited many. Others were given a misdemeanor charge and sent to detention for anywhere from 1 to 6 months. Groups of 10 individuals processed together in under 10 minutes. Their stories, their reasons for migration, their stories of families, hopes, traumas, none of this considered in this court process. Not welcomed, not honored, and this happened again and again until all 75 people had been run through the system and taken away in shackles once more. Operation Streamline happens 5 days a week in multiple locations along the border. It was such a dehumanizing and degrading process. And I wondered what would have been the verdict if instead of the 75 migrants, my country, my homeland instead had been on trial that day. On that day, we also met Lois, a court supporter and a volunteer with No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, an organization that leaves water and supplies in the desert where migrants are crossing, an organization that might have come to your attention recently with the trial of Scott Warren, who was arrested and charged with harboring for leaving water in the desert and taking in several migrants who were suffering dehydration. So Lois is also an organizer in the End Streamline Coalition, and throughout her weeks, she goes with other volunteers to sit and watch and bear witness so there can be some accountability in this process, listening for who is an asylum seeker here, writing down their names, listening for what are the stories that they're telling about the Customs Border Patrol taking their documents from them, and writing down these discrepancies so that they can try to end this process, this practice of Operation Streamline. And Lois quickly became one of my heroes, listening to her. Lois is 84 years old, and she moved to the border after retiring from teaching college in Massachusetts, where she taught Latin American history and took student groups down to Central America as part of her teaching career. And she moved to the border to become involved with this network of people and communities that are organizing to bear witness and support migrants along the border. And I remember her telling us what we would be seeing in the courtroom, drawing the lines of connection between the interwoven histories of the U.S. and Latin America, and linking the system of private detention with the policies that criminalize migrants. She told us of how our current immigration policy is basically controlled by the corporations who profit off of detaining immigrants, such as Core Civic and Geo Group, which collectively manage more than half of the private prison contracts in the country. As it has come all the much more into your attention this last week with the arrest and detention of Francisco Morales, who is currently, I believe he's in the Tacoma Detention Center, the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. This detention center is one of the largest in the nation. It has 1,575 beds in it, and it is owned by the Geo Group. It is for profit. And in 2017 alone, this collection of for-profit prisons, these corporations earned combined revenue exceeding $4 billion and have spent millions on lobbying and campaign contributions. I think this is one of the most corrupt pieces of it for me. This is one of the pieces that cuts very deeply of the harm that's being happened and the trauma that's happening to families for profit. As a Unitarian Universalist, I can't let that stand. And so as Lois was talking to us, and throughout that whole week, I was learning more and more to understand how when trying to understand border and immigration policy, it's essential to follow the money and to ask who profits from all this suffering. So on the second day of this journey, we walked in the Sonoran Desert, where people cross from Mexico into the United States. A trail that people have traversed for God knows how many generations in the history of migration to and from lands seeking the conditions of life. And crossing this desert is dangerous, and those who risk it are vulnerable to dehydration, flash floods, accident, and being picked up by the Border Patrol. For groups such as No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, who go into the desert to leave water and food, it is not uncommon for them to find remains of people who do not make it. It is so dangerous. The terrain where we walked was mountainous and rocky. Several of us fell on loose soil and rocks as we went. The colors all around us were shades of dust. It's okay. No, it's all good. I love having the generations together. This is what church is. Thank you. The terrain where we walked was mountainous and rocky. Several of us fell as we were going on the loose soil, and the colors all around were these shades of dusty red and brown and green under this blue sky. It was beautiful in this strange and tragic way. All around us, cacti and scrub brush dotting the landscape, and each of us carried jugs of water to leave for the people passing through. As we walked into the desert, we walked by signs of migrants who had been there before, clothes that had been abandoned and lost along the way, a backpack caught in the brush of a dry riverbed, a black jug now empty of water. The jugs that migrants carry are black so they don't glow at night and alert surveillance, for this desert is closely watched. We hiked a couple of miles into that terrain and left our jugs of water at points where humanitarian aid groups before us had also left water and food. On the jugs were written messages of love and hope in Sharpie. Messages like agua es vida, vaya con Dios, fuerza, strength, no están solas, you are not alone. And we left our water jugs and prayed for the people who might come across them in their long walk through the desert and into uncertainty. And as we walked, I tried to imagine what might compel me to make such a risky and arduous journey. I prayed with my feet as we moved and walked, and I imagined the hopes, fears, and relationships and longings that were carried by the people who had passed that way before, connecting with my own hopes, fears, and longings. It was really humbling to return to where we were staying that night, all exhausted after only a few hours, walking in the desert to a warm meal, a hot shower, and a safe place to sleep, knowing that so many were not so privileged. To cross the desert takes multiple days, even weeks, and people are there right now, walking for their lives. So the wall is imposing, the court is unforgiving, and the desert is dangerous. And yet these are not the only stories of the border, for love and resilience also live in the middle and in the midst of these places. While we were there, we met with a grassroots Chicano organization called Flowers and Bullets that is coming together to plant flowers and gardens and make public art in a neighborhood in southern Tucson, planting seeds of healing as they do this, recovering the ancient wisdom of their ancestors who have tilled the soil since long before a fence was ever built or a border ever imagined in that place. We met with Carolina, also, a trans woman from Mexico who made the crossing when she was just 12 years old, after surviving first on the streets of Mexico and then on the streets of Arizona, having been rejected by her family. She was detained as an adult for 3.5 years as she sought her asylum case with the support of Mariposas Sin Fronteras, Butterflies Without Borders, which is an organization that works tirelessly to support LGBTQ immigrants, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer immigrants in detention through writing letters, visiting detainees, raising bond, and accompanying people through this search for asylum. You should know that within WISN, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, here too are groups of people that are working together to support LGBTQ asylum seekers from detention into host homes and through this process of seeking asylum and seeking refuge, because it's not safe for them oftentimes to go back to their home countries for who they are and who they love. So in the borderlands, as we were hearing all these stories and visiting places, I could not find reasons to feel optimistic, but I did encounter deep hope among the people there. It still does bloom like a desert flower, tenacious, surprising, and beautiful. There in the borderlands, there is this courageous love that has the power to transform. It is a steady heartbeat in the lands in the midst of so much heartbreak, and I tell this not to comfort you, but to strengthen you. For what has been previously, the trauma of the border exists all across the nation. When I asked Alejandro what has changed since Trump's presidency, he shared that in many ways, Arizona still feels the same. What is different is that what was begun in Arizona has now spread across the nation. ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and Border Patrol, the two federal bodies designated to enforce immigration, are becoming increasingly emboldened. Just, I think about 2 months ago, actually, a man was detained in Whatcom County, and Border Patrol broke his window. One of his children was in his back seat, broke his window, and pulled him from his vehicle. This should alarm us. The fact that Tacoma has one of the largest immigrant prisons in the country, this should alarm us. So the border is everywhere, and the resilience increasingly also is everywhere, including here in Washington. Washington actually has this phenomenal history of immigrant justice work that goes well back into the 1980s when the Central American refugees were coming here. And the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project actually began in that moment, a collection of volunteer lawyers to come together to support them in their journey towards seeking asylum status. This is an image here of an action that was happening outside of the ICE detention center, and within this picture are a number of actually Unitarians from UUC, I'm proud to say, and this was, the organizer here is Montserrat Padilla, and she's one of the lead organizers with WISN, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. And this was on a day that Jose Robles, who has been in sanctuary for over a year in a Lutheran church in Seattle, was going in for his check-in. And so probably 250 people showed up on this day to accompany him and his family at this check-in. And on that day, he was detained. And he's still in detention now about 6 months later. He was just denied bond this last week. But this community is still working for his release and is still in solidarity with him, and increasingly with more families. As you all are in solidarity, this community showed up in solidarity to Francisco Morales, his wife, and his children. And I find this to be a cause for great hope in these times. I really do. Immigrant justice has been something that has captured my heart since I was in college and went to El Salvador for the first time. And this was also when the first seeds of ministry got planted into my soul. I was being down there and learning about liberation theology and learning that church and justice could be one, and compassion could be one. And this is my plea right now for those of you here, is if this is also your heart's calling, and maybe your heart was just shaken awake this last week because it affected your community. It took someone from his family, someone that you know, and it was astonishing. Over $40,000 were raised, I think, in 24 hours to support Francisco and his family right now. And that makes a difference. The letters make a difference. The fact that the courts will see how supported he is. It's not a guarantee, unfortunately, but it makes a difference. And so on this morning, before I close out, I'd encourage you to listen for what is calling you right now. Whether it's deeper relationship, getting involved in one of the ESL classes, maybe giving, being generous with the resources you have, giving to the Fair Fight Bond Fund. I feel like I'm doing an altar call right now, but I feel so passionately about this that I'm leaving the notes I have and speaking to you as a member of this faith, to other people who feel called by justice and compassion in these times. Personally, I don't know how I'd be getting through it if I were not involved in communities of action. It makes a difference. So there are a number of people here today that you can have more conversation with afterwards. If you're curious about how you might start and forming a network to respond when someone is detained, to respond rapidly, or to how to support people who are in detention now. So the borderlands, they are a unique place in geography and in political circumstances, political environment. It's a place of both tragedy and of hope. And in many ways, the borderlands are everywhere. So I leave you with these questions on this morning. What walls are you ready to dismantle that are before your own eyes? What borders run through your own life that separate you? And what fences are you ready to reach through and to grasp the hands with people on the other side and say, I see you. I love you. I'm with you. And together we will work for a changed tomorrow.